Okay, good evening. We're going to move into week 7 of the Intro to Philosophy material. And this week we're moving on from the proofs for God's existence to the main issue in terms of an obstacle to believing in God, and that is the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is such that in fact, it goes back to some of the earliest writing. In fact, the oldest writing in the Bible is not the book of Genesis. It is the book of Job, actually. It's the most ancient of the manuscripts, and it predates the book of Genesis and the other books of the Bible. And the book of Job is basically about this individual who is very successful, and he has many children, and there is this character called the Satan. And the Satan is basically an adversary, a lawyer, basically. Don't read too much into that, but basically the Satan means an individual who is an accuser. And Satan goes to God and says, God says, "What have you been doing?" And Satan says, "I've been walking around to and fro upon the earth." And God says, "Have you seen my servant Job? There's no one like him." And Satan says, the Satan says to him, to God, "Yeah, if he's only on your side, God, because he's got it good." So God says to the Satan, "Okay, you can give him physical ailments, but don't kill him." So Satan gives him these physical ailments, and Job's not happy, but Job still does not give up on God. Satan goes back to God. God says, "Have you seen my servant Job?" The Satan says, "Yeah, but if you hurt him economically, take away his children, so on, that'll he'll curse you to your face." So the Satan goes, kills all of Job's children, takes all of his, wipes out all of his fortune, and Job's wife says, "Curse God and die." Job says, "Not going to do that." Job has 3 so-called comforters. They're not very helpful, but they come to him and they sit with him for 7 days and nights. They don't even say anything. And then finally they say, "Okay, Job, here's the deal. These things only happen to bad people. So what did you do?" And Job says, "I've done nothing wrong." And so there's a long argument among all of them. And finally, God interrupts and says, "Job has done nothing wrong. In fact, you're the ones who've done something wrong because you attempted to suggest that he had done something wrong, and he clearly hasn't. So you're the ones to blame here." Job never gets an answer. And his health is restored, and so are his fortunes. And so that's the end of the story. So this is the oldest problem, at least in theism. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen at all? And so the Bible clearly says it's not because you've done something wrong. It clearly isn't. Occasionally there are these stories where that happens, but Job is the main one you have to pay attention here to. That is, if you're a theist. So the problem is, if God is all powerful, and the word there is omnipotent. If God is all good, and the word there is omnibenevolent, uh, why is there evil? So this becomes a problem. So either you can deny one of these things. You can say, well, evil really isn't evil, and most people aren't going to go for that. So they're going to look at the 2 other things. So either God isn't all good, and that's really kind of the route that if you're David Hume, you'd say, yeah, God might be powerful, but God just simply isn't all that good. Or God's not all powerful, and that's another route you could go with it too, that God simply can't do some things. And this is going to be kind of the route that most thinkers will go. Most people who call themselves theists will say, yeah, you have to think about, what does this all powerful mean? Does it mean God can do things that are impossible for anyone? No. So God can't make square circles. If God gives you free will, you can't have a coerced free will, because if it's free, it means it's not coerced, and if it's coerced, it means it's not free. So okay, so there are clearly some things that God cannot do. Okay, so that's not even on the table. So then it becomes a question of, what are the things, are there other things that God can't do besides make square circles and coerce people's free will? And by the way, don't go to this notion of, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. That is not God coercing Pharaoh's free will. It gets a little bit complicated there, but it's basically, Pharaoh still has free will, and it's a bit more complicated than that, than just simply say, oh, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, you can harden someone's heart by irritating them repeatedly. Okay, so that's not a that's not a real problem. So the question then becomes, what are the different ways you can explain evil? Or you can give a what we call a theodicy, theodicy. That's to speak for God. How do you speak for God in the face of evil? Historically, there have been a number of them, and we'll go from kind of the most extreme to the more common now. So one extreme view is called High Calvinism. It's associated with the religious thinker John Calvin. And there really aren't any people of there are no serious Christians or serious scholars who take this view anymore. And that this is the view that God foreknows and predestines every single event. So there really is no free will. And this is why most people don't accept it, because you don't have freedom. So everything happens because God wills it. So God willed the Holocaust. God willed this pandemic. God willed everything. Excuse me. So you don't have to be too smart to figure out that if God is doing this, then God is the author of evil. And if God is the author of evil, if God is causing evil, then God's not worthy of worship, and so God's not good. So what High Calvinism does is that it takes away God's goodness, and so there might be one or two people around. I think there's a guy named John Piper. He might, I'm pretty sure he's a High Calvinist. Excuse me, he's actually a pastor. He's not a serious academic, and no one really takes him seriously. I know he's got a big church, but he's his approach is really facile. It's just it's not substantive. A more traditional approach that tries to do something similar to that is the view of St. Augustine. So what Augustine says is that, God knows what's going to happen, but God does not choose for it to happen. Excuse me. So this is the idea that, free will is a human capacity that God cannot control because it's free. So God knows what people are going to do, but God doesn't, cause them to do it. So the analogy you would give is this. Suppose you know that there's a tree that's about to die, or it's dead, and it's about to fall over. So your knowing it's going to fall over doesn't cause it to fall over, okay? So that becomes an issue with, excuse me, it becomes an issue where you're able to seemingly save this idea of human freedom, while at the same time saving God's knowledge of what's going to happen. Okay, so far so good, but there are really kind of two problems with this. The first problem with that is it explains kind of human evil in terms of moral evil. So we've talked about moral evil, and we've talked about a little bit natural evil. So moral evil is like if I poke someone in the eye, I had freedom, I did it, and I'm responsible for it. So that's moral evil. But then there's natural evil, and natural evil is that kind of thing where it's there are earthquakes, there are hurricanes, there are tornadoes, these kinds of things that happen. And so on the one hand, you could say, okay, God permits free will, but why can't God just simply stop these hurricanes and tornadoes? Okay, and so that's one of the problems. The second problem is there's not really a similar relationship between my knowledge of the tree falling and God's knowledge of what's going to happen. And here's the problem with that, and that is, if God knows something's going to happen, there's no way for me or anyone to act contrary to what God knows absolutely will happen, okay? And so there's a sense in which God's knowledge functions as a kind of restriction on anything in the world that will happen. So God's relationship to me acting is disanalogous. It's not at all like my relationship to the tree falling. So that creates this problem of God's knowing it makes it so. The person who is a more contemporary version of Augustine is C.S. Lewis, who says it's like God's writing a book, or the author of a book, and so the author stands above the book, and so even though we might be all on page 192, God knows what's going to happen at the end of the book. Why? Because God wrote the book, even though the characters seem to be acting on their own. Excuse me, in the book. So that's made a lot of theists frustrated, because they think, oh, well, again, this seems to make God the author of evil. Okay. Then you get another approach, which is developed by a Jesuit, actually, named Molina. Yeah, like the St. Louis Cardinals catcher. And these people are called Molinists. And what Molina says is something like this. So God knows all possible worlds in which everyone makes free choices. So this is a huge number of worlds in which, so there's a world in which I have the TV on right now. There's a world in which I don't have the TV on right now. There's a world in which I'm walking my dog right now. So you think of all the free choices you make in a day. You think of all the people who make free choices in the day, all around the world throughout history. So that's an awful lot, isn't it? So God knows all of these worlds, but God decides to instantiate one of them, and that's the best of all possible worlds. So it's like having a huge kind of Netflix library of all these different possible worlds, and God decides to press play on one of them, and that's the world that we have. Once again, you can say, well, this is a world in which I made a free choice, but once this world starts, I really don't have a free choice to act contrary to what God knows is going on. So that's left some people frustrated as well. So there are so right now, the people who are arguing are, in terms of contemporary issues, are kind of the Augustinians, these Molinists, and then two other groups. The next group is called the open theists. And open theists are people who believe that the future is open, in this sense, that God can know anything that can be known, but the future is not something that can be known. Therefore, God can't know it. And so if God knew what the future was, then we wouldn't have freedom. So God knows all the possible choices we could make. So he knows the possibilities, but does not determine us to one of those. So it's kind of like, it's there used to be these things called choose your own adventure books, or kind of, it's like you're playing a video game where you have choices where you can make. So God is like the computer programmer, doesn't know what all the individual outcomes will be, but in the end, God knows what God's going to do, okay, but not necessarily what you're going to do. And so this preserves kind of God's knowledge, such as it is, but not to the future. So God knows everything in the past and the present, but God does not know the future. And then you've got the final view, and God can act, in certain ways here, that God wants to act. But the last view is a view called process theism. And process thought is this, is that God acts only by persuasion. God does not coerce anything. So all creatures are basically free. God does not know the future, and God does not act coercively ever in terms of doing anything. So could God stop a hurricane? Only if somehow God persuaded the hurricane not to, the elements there, something like that. So this is the view where there's a lot of evil that God just simply cannot do anything about because it's part of the world, okay? So God could not stop the Holocaust. It's impossible for God to do that kind of thing, because God could try to persuade people, but God cannot, in the end, just simply unilaterally stop things from happening, okay? So that's kind of the overview of kind of the different possibilities. And of course, there's this idea of soul making. Some of you have picked up on that, and that's associated with this early thinker called Irenaeus, the idea that God has created us kind of at a distance, so that some of the conditions of the world make us rely upon God or turn to God, because if everything was perfect, we would have no need for God in that sense. So looking at, for example, the story in Genesis would be one where you are seeing it as a story about all human beings. It's not saying this is how evil came into the world. It's just simply a kind of a parable, if you will. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop there and see if you all have any questions on any of these views or anything so far in the readings.
There is one thing I would like some clarification on because I'm not sure if I'm totally understanding it.
Okay.
So, for the free will defense, so are you saying that God can't be all knowing in that defense because he doesn't know what choices humans are going to make? Or he is all knowing because he, knows what evil is going to happen
Okay.
and
That's okay. So the free will defense can be used in a couple of these different ones. It can't be used in the in the high Calvinist view because you really don't have free will there. Okay, so that one's kind of off the table there for that. But what like with Augustine, what you're saying, Augustine wants to say that yeah, you do have freedom, but God's knowing something doesn't make it happen. And so that's Augustine's contention. And then people like the open theists and the process theists would say, yes, it does, because God's knowing it. You can't act against something that will infallibly come true because, if God knows all of history, past, present, and future, right? And God will never be mistaken about what God knows, right? So the famous example is right now, God knows what I'm going to have for breakfast tomorrow, okay? And God knows, for example, that I'm going to have an omelet for breakfast tomorrow. So, but if God knows it, it's impossible for me to act against what God knows, right? So Augustine's account of the free will defense is problematic because it ends up making God's knowledge, a constraint upon my action. Okay, and that's why people move away from that to something like Molinism or open theism. But both Molinism and open theism are both trying to maintain, yeah, free will is why bad things happen, at least moral evil. Free will is why that happens. But then why doesn't God do something about natural evil? The process thinkers are saying, yeah, it's because God can't. And for some others, I mean, it might be the case for all we know that some miracles are possible for God, like curing people of cancer, but some other miracles aren't possible. And part of that is because we don't know all the rules by which God can do miracles, right? So, but the free will defense is mainly to account for any kind of moral evil, all right? But, but oftentimes moral evil results in physical evil at the same time. So anyway, does that help a little bit?
yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. All right. And I'm not expecting you to buy into any one of them. I want you to be able to see what the problems are. But historically, these days, there's no one really buying into high Calvinism because it's just really problematic. And it's the kind of view that, well, God wanted this to happen. So God wanted you to get cancer, or God wanted that person to die in the car accident. God not only knew it, but God wanted that to happen. That really kind of makes God into a problem, right? But on the other end are the process people saying, well, what actually can God do? Well, God is there to suffer with you. God is a friend and helping you, and God tries to help persuade the universe. But and many people find that unsatisfactory because it's taking away too much of God's power. Okay, so if you're going to be a theist, it's probably I think there's something in between there, and that's where the Molinists and the open theists and others come into play. All right. Other questions? Okay, well, if not, then that will wrap it up for this week, and I'll post this, and I will see you online. Feel free to bring in up anything from the the Zoom in the discussion and engage that, and I'll be very happy to see that. Okay. All right. We'll see you all next time.